Christopher Linforth est un écrivain britannique. Il a grandi en Angleterre et vit actuellement dans le nord de l'Irlande où il travaille comme professeur. Christopher a étudié aux États-Unis et il y a vécu plusieurs années. Il est titulaire d'un doctorat d'anglais et d'un MFA en Creative Writing, un master en écriture littéraire. Son domaine de prédilection, c'est la nouvelle. Il est l'auteur de 3 recueils. When You Find Us, We Will Be Gone, publié par Lamar University Press en 2014. Directory, publié par Otis Books, NC City, édition en 2020. Et The Distortions, son dernier recueil, publié chez Orison Books en 2022, qui a reçu le prix 2020 Orison Books Fiction Prize. De plus, ses histoires ont été publiées dans une centaine de magazines littéraires. Christopher écrit que depuis de nombreuses années, il intègre l'étude du paysage et de l'environnement dans sa pratique artistique, et qu'en raison de son éducation léventine au Royaume-Uni, l'un de ses intérêts de longue date est la psychogéographie, c'est-à-dire les liens qui existent entre les personnes et les lieux, et qu'il s'intéresse à la cartographie textuelle de ces relations, the connection between people and places, and the textual mapping of these relationships. Et ce n'est évidemment pas un hasard s'il s'est beaucoup intéressé dans ses fictions à la situation de l'ex-Yougoslavie. Il ajoute qu'il lui est plus facile d'écrire sur un lieu où il n'est pas présent, que le pouvoir de la mémoire et de l'imagination pousse son travail plus loin et plus profondément. Christopher a également publié de nombreux essais dans des revues littéraires anglophones, américaines et européennes, ainsi que des critiques littéraires dans différents magazines. Il a remporté le prix 2019 Epiphany's Breakout and Fiction Prize et a été finaliste pour le prix Witness Magazine's Fiction Prize. Il travaille actuellement sur un nouveau recueil de nouvelles qu'il aime à décrire comme des flash fictions.
We read from a couple of different things. The first one is a book of flash fiction that I wrote a few years ago in Vermont. So just very short things. So this flash is called Timber. The tree fell on our mother. A neighbour identified it as a lodgepole pine. He was an expert, so he claimed, said he once worked as an arborist. He wore coveralls and a leather tool belt. His workman boots were dull and scuffed. He stood next to the tree and scratched his thick beard. Our mother was silent, only a stiff hand visible. The neighbour axed off the branches, sawed the trunk into neat circles. Wafer-thin slices he sold as flying discs, replacements for vinyl. He hawked pine needles as mementos of our mother. She wouldn't have minded, the neighbour told us. She was always fond of that tree. For as long as we could remember, our mother had never mentioned the lodgepole pine. She seldom left the house or chatted with strangers. Still, it was a fine tree. We helped the neighbour carve a casket from the heartwood. Together we lowered her body into the smooth vessel. We applied layers of black varnish, a final waterproof lacquer. The neighbour said it resembled a torpedo. We felt honoured. Our father had been a Marine. We knew little else about him. Years before the tree incident, our mother just liked to tell us he'd been at sea. A sailor, a lance corporal, a machine gunner. The story changed, yet somehow remained the same. The neighbour listened to our stories as we launched the casket into the river. Our mother floated away, back toward the ocean. We called after her as loud as we could. Let the people know she was coming. That was a flash. And then, as Sophie said, I wrote a book about the kind of like post-Yugoslavia kind of like situation, various stories. I'm just going to read a very short excerpt and then I'm going to move on to a new novel I started at the Chateau. So this short story is called May Our Ghosts Stay With Us. In the winter of 1991, my grandfather's charred body appeared on the television news. The reporter lifted a blanket off my grandfather's face. His eyes had been hacked out with a knife, and then his clothes doused with gasoline and set alight, and he was left to burn to death in the street outside of his house. I cannot imagine, even as I watch the newsreel again, in the comfort of my university office, the pain he experienced, or the shock my grandmother felt as the men made her watch. These men were not soldiers of the Yugoslav National Army or any official military. They were hired thugs and fanatics, persuaded to cross the border and terrorize the villages of Vocin. For the last 20 years, I've been processing the images of my grandfather's death. Aided by Xanax and a fine collection of Speyside and Islay whiskies, I have in recent months been completing his autobiography, ghostwriting the last part of his life. I came across his diary in the papers of my father. Just after the Millennium, he died of a heart attack. My mother shipped all his files to me. I hid the boxes in the corner of my office and draped the Croatian flag over them, trying to forget what lay beneath. After a decade of lecturing at the University of Zagreb, my career in the world of film studies had arrived at an impasse. I cared little about my students' thoughts on the metaphysics of Disney villains, or the myopic post-everything theories of my colleagues. In truth, I felt a certain longing to be close to my father again, and I lifted off the flag, folding it neatly on my desk. Dust motes swirled in the air, catching the light. I watched the particles for a moment, then I sliced open the boxes, unearthing an archive of my father's life. Folders of medical records, stacks of maps and weather reports, yellow telephone directories, photographs of burnt-out houses, six drafts of my father's sub-Brechtian play, each revision more misguided than the last. Stuck between a pair of historical volumes on Yugoslavia sat the diary, a plain leather-bound book. So that story goes on. Gives you a hint of that one. Supposedly, while I was here, I was meant to write a kind of sister book to that one, which kind of took place before the war, and it's still out there. But I was inspired to start a new novel a couple of weeks ago, so I'm going to read from that. And all you really need to know is that it takes place at the end of 1999, just before the Millennium. And the narrator is a woman called Alice, who's in her late 30s, and we're in San Diego. And the novel's called Bug. Snow came in the months after his death. The TV in our shared apartment played a video documentary on a loop. Somehow, after the funeral, one of his friends had messed around with a VCR, set it up to rewind and play the tape over and over. The documentary was an incomplete version of Finlandia, a propaganda film from the 1920s. Then there was a minute of static, and a Sunrise organic cereal commercial. 30 seconds of a joyous family devouring bowls of puffed beige grains. It was a relief when the tape auto-rewound and began again. I watched the film for days at a time. I closed the blinds and lay on the sofa, a blanket covering the cold white leather, the place of M's death. I lay there for so long, recreating M's death pose that my limbs would stiffen. Occasionally I'd stand and gently stretch, stupidly laugh at the yoga I used to do. I opened the blinds. Outside, the ever-present sunshine of San Diego lit up the painted concrete houses and palm trees, and the freeway and ocean beyond. Everything was clear and in blinding technicolor. Everyone in the city was eating Sunrise organic cereal. But then I could see a yellow haze settling in, smog brought by the Santa Ana winds from Los Angeles. I slumped back on the sofa, preferring the stark black and white of a foreign city black and white of a foreign country. I'd never been anywhere near the Baltic and that long strip of snowed-in land. But something about days without sunlight struck me as cathartic and re-energizing. If I could feel the icy darkness around me, envelop my body, reveal its naked core, tell me how I was meant to live now, then perhaps I could recover from his death. I struggled to say M's name. Even when I went to see my therapist, Andras, I could not vocalize his name. Andras was based in La Mesa, in a nondescript building at the end of a strip mall, but I liked it that way. He had no secretary or assistant, and I had fantasized many times about us having sex in his office. Originally from Hungary or Bulgaria, it was never quite clear. Andras was a clear decade older then my 30-odd years. He usually wore carefully creased brown pants and a grey tucked-in shirt, no tie. He held a notebook in his lap, a pack of cigarettes marking the right page. "How are you today, Alice?" he said. "I sit at home watching the same documentary about Finland." "That's good," he said. "Aren't the Finns the happiest people in the world?" "Are they?" "I read it somewhere," he said. "Where?" "Online." "The internet?" "Yes," he said, "it's not so strange. Finns don't smile." "Where did you read that?" "One of the usual online sites." "Smiling is an American habit," he said. "It's a facade like everything else in the country." Andrus lit a cigarette and didn't offer me one. "Do you want to talk about M's death today?" "Can I just watch you smoke?" I said. Andrus studied me, his eyes slowly blinking yes. His cigarette sat perfectly between his lips. He breathed in ever so slightly, the end burning red. He removed the cigarette and exhaled. Smoke channeled out from his lips, a gauzy cloud rising in the space between us. He allowed a moment of contemplation between each gentle toke, as though he was philosophizing about the nature of our relationship. I imagined straddling him, then tilting his head, letting the smoke drift into my mouth. He pressed the stub into the glass ashtray, the last trail of smoke corkscrewed up into midair. I thanked him and left his office. I felt guilty about M. Before his death, we had not had sex for months. He was almost 50. He said he didn't need Viagra. He was natural, virile, just never in the mood. I drove for a while. Though it was late November, stores were putting up their Christmas decorations. Bright red, green and yellow lights dotted storefronts. Life-size fiberglass Santa Clauses were being dragged out and placed in front of liquor stores and pawn shops and luxury clothes boutiques. At one intersection, a tattered billboard depicted a cockroach, its carapace filled in with Y2K. Bold black text reminded you to turn off your home computer on the last day of the Millennium. The world was going to end in a matter of weeks. Not that this fear stopped my friends discussing their new Millennium plans. Kristen had a reservation for the library tower in downtown Los Angeles. "I'll be able to see everything," she gushed, "and there are rumours Puff Daddy will be there." I stifled a laugh. Not to be outdone, Cassandra had booked a series of plane tickets to a remote island in the Pacific, to be among the first in the world to see in the new Millennium. "The greatest moment since Christ's birth," she said, "and only 1 year early," I replied. Cassandra had not come to terms with the mechanics of the Gregorian calendar, which started with year 1. "And what about you?" she said. Eb and I had planned nothing of note. We discussed dinner at home and a walk along Tourmaline Beach. A few days before his death, he suggested we take ecstasy and let the waves roll in over our bodies. But then M died. I came home from a spin class and found him lying on the sofa, his limbs stiff and cold, awkwardly angled as though he was attempting to sit up, but had fallen back down. A streak of vomit cascaded from one side of his mouth. I was unsure of whether he had choked on something or if the vomit was a reaction to one of his many medications. I touched his forehead and knelt down and looked into his eyes. They were angled ceilingward. I turned around, tried to focus on what he had last seen. Then I screamed, and a neighbour came, and the rest I do not remember. Thank you.